Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me here today on the YouTube channel of Made of Millions. Thank you so much if you're a return visitor. If this is your first time here, welcome to the 5-part series on digital wellness. My name is Teodora Pavkovic. I'm a psychotherapist and a parenting coach. And in my work, I focus on digital wellness, emotional intelligence, and parenting in the age of technology. And so, if you were here for the first episode, you know that we talked about digital wellness, where I outlined some of the kind of the basic concepts of what digital wellness means. It's still a very kind of new phenomenon. Not too many people are aware of it yet, even though each one of us really needs to be very mindful of our levels of digital wellness. For the second episode, I focused on social media because I think it is a really huge part of our lives that we need to pay a lot of attention to and need to pay a lot of attention to how digital wellness unfolds on all of those various platforms. For the third part, we talked about children and technology. For part 4, I was talking about parenting in the age of technology. And then for today's episode, for the final one, Episode 5, I'm going to be talking a little bit about technology inside the classroom and inside the office. And so if you're joining me here live, please feel free to say hello in the comment section. I'm seeing some greetings coming in already. Hi, thank you so much for joining us again. You'll also see, or you should be able to see in the comment section, a few of the handles and ways to find both the mental health advocacy organization Made of Millions, which is making all of this possible for us today, as well as myself. So you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook, whatever your preference is. And then if you would like to get in touch, you can see my email address there as well. If you would like any additional resources on anything that I'm talking about today, or if you have any questions that we maybe don't really get a chance to address during this live broadcast, please feel free to reach out. So let's begin. So we're going to begin today's episode with a very old painting by the well-known Ninja Turtle called Raphael, or rather the otherwise known high Italian Renaissance painter Raphael, which may seem kind of a little bit of a strange place to start, except that if you know me, you know that art history is my other greatest passion aside from psychology. But also this wall painting is hugely relevant to our topic today because it's called the School of Athens. And one of the many things that it represents, to me at least, is really how we used to learn in the deepest sense of that word. So, how we used to obtain knowledge, how we used to share knowledge, how we used to create and think, and what it really used to mean to be productive and to be innovative, because that is essentially what our topic for today is. We're talking about a classroom setting in which, of course, we want to encourage the discovery of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. And we're talking about our workplaces and our offices, places in which we want to try and be as creative and innovative and collaborative and productive as we possibly can. Now, while there are many philosophers painted in this painting, one whom I just kind of briefly want to mention is Socrates, who is not the focus of this mural, but he had a lot to say about a new form of communication and technology that emerged during his time, and that was writing. So he was hugely opposed to it. He basically said that this kind of introduction of writing as a technique, as a learning, as a communication technique, is going to cause huge amounts of forgetfulness, is going to result in us being exposed to a lot of information, but actually learning of nothing. He also said that it would give us a kind of false sense of all knowing, a sense of all knowingness, and that it would really cause a huge amount of dependence on this new form of technology. And what I find incredibly interesting is that even though he wrote about this in about the 4th century before Christ, if you look at these ideas that he's putting forward, I think they're incredibly applicable even today. And we do see a case of history repeating itself with the very different, but the new forms of technology that we're using today, and we're seeing them causing a lot of the same things. So his views are often being used in in a bunch of different articles. You may have come across them yourself, in order to support this idea that, people have always complained about new forms of technology, new forms of innovation, and they've perhaps always been a little bit kind of over dramatic and had over dramatic reactions to them. But I think one thing that we need to remember here is that Socrates wasn't actually wrong. And so if you look at the introduction of writing and the kind of changes that it did actually cause, it really did cause all of these things to happen. And the technology that we're using today, the how of how we're using the technology today, is really resulting in a lot of these similar things. And so we're going to take a look at technology in the classroom first, and then we're going to move over to technology in the workplace or the office. And I wanted to set the section up by highlighting a few key phenomena or trends that we're seeing within the education system, but within parenting as well, that are making it very, very hard for children, so exceptionally hard. And I've liberally used the New Yorker's cartoons here because they tell these stories exceptionally well. I think a lot better than I could. But I've numbered these just so you can kind of follow me as I'm explaining some of them. Although, again, I think a picture paints it 1,000 words, and I think these cartoons do such a great job. The first one talks about boredom and says so much just in that small little picture. So there's this expectation, which has probably always existed from the side of children, that boredom will be alleviated by parents, and in today's world that will likely happen via tech. On the other hand, we have this kind of, in a way, parental acceptance of this expectation and responsibility as well, that has done some very interesting things for parent-child interactions and for the way children play today. Number two, we have these expectations of children's performances that have just gone through the roof, especially over the past maybe kind of 10 or 20 years even, resulting in these very, very staged, very rehearsed attempts to get children into the best schools, whatever that might mean to you, making it incredibly confusing, incredibly stressful to kids. And you have this line here from a father leaning over saying to his son, "Now remember, be the yourself that we talked about." So I think that one is really, really brilliant. Number three, then we have this phenomenon of helicopter parenting that's been talked about a lot. It essentially is represented by this kind of over involvement in children's lives, and it actually leaves children, even though it doesn't really mean to, but it leaves them feeling incredibly incompetent, incredibly unprepared, with a huge impact on their self-esteem, their sense of self-worth, and their ability to regulate emotions as well, which is one of the most problematic things here. But this line reads, "My parents didn't write it, they just tweaked it," which is quite funny. Number four, I think, complements number two as well. So we see this kind of little kind of kindergarten preschool schedule for kids, and we see on the list there at noon an SAT prep. So again, these expectations that have been brought way, way forward, and are burdening very small children who are just not developmentally equipped to meet these expectations at all, really. Number five then really moves into the tech field and the messaging when it comes to how children in particular are using tech. So again, here, I think talking about reliance on technology, but also this kind of displacement of real life skills or skills that we're supposed to be exhibiting in the real world, displaced into the digital world, and a kind of rehearsing also of real life skills on kind of on technology first, and then actually enacting them in real life. So this little cartoon here under number five said, "Now this is just a simulation of what the blocks will look like once they're assembled," right? So there's this kind of digital virtual practicing first of something that is actually going to be enacted afterwards, an unnecessary step in a lot of cases, if you ask me. And then finally, this again, this reliance on technology that I think doesn't just speak to kids, but adults as well, and a kind of relinquishing of personal responsibility. So the boy here who says that the cloud actually ate his homework, it's no longer the house pet. And again, I think that even though it's a staggering number of years later, I think this does in a sense mirror and reflect what Socrates was saying about writing as well. So it's that relinquishing of responsibility from ourselves, from our own brains. Really, I like to call it a kind of outsourcing of our frontal lobes as well. So we're going to look at the state of tech in the classroom first, and then we're going to talk about some of the highlights of what the research has found. And then finally, I'm going to move into a kind of a list of suggestions for best practices. And I think, the kind of the best place to look at really is teachers' comments and teachers' feedback on what they're seeing in the classroom. And you can see here again that I'm using research carried out by Common Sense Media, as I've done throughout my 5-part series. So I really encourage you to go to their website. And if you're interested in all the details when it comes to this report in particular, it is called the Common Sense Census Inside the 21st Century Classroom. And this is data from 2019. So again, you see a lot of data here. Like I said, I'm going to go into the highlights of this research in a couple of slides. Here, just to kind of give you one kind of small but very significant highlight, is these kind of green and blue lines that you're seeing there in the bottom half. And what they represent really is this divide between digital tool use and the perceived effectiveness that the teachers are seeing. And you can see that in science, for example, there's a huge discrepancy there between the tech that is actually being used and then the tech that teachers actually believe is highly effective and highly useful to serve whatever the purpose is. Over here, what we're seeing is some of the biggest concerns that educators have when it comes to technology. I think they do go line in line with what I was talking about last week in terms of parental concerns as well. So some of the biggest ones really are evaluation of online information. So things like fake news, being able to really discern what is useful, what is not useful, what is real, what isn't real. The distractiveness of technology, we also call this technoference, is another really, really big concern. And then what we're seeing here in terms of digital citizenship curricula is that a lot of teachers do find it to be incredibly important, and a significant number of them do find them to be useful as well. Although I'll show you just now that there is a certain amount of discrepancy there as well in terms of how much teachers feel that there's a need to be teaching these types of curricula, but then also the perceived effectiveness of them as well. So these are some of the highlights. So only about 52% of teachers rated digital citizenship courses as being very effective or extremely effective. So only about 52% were kind of raging fans of it. So I feel that is definitely one area that needs a little bit more improvement, although the number of teachers who teach these curricula and the number of schools that implement them now has gone up a lot, which is a wonderful thing to see. Like I said, teachers' top concerns really are the critical evaluation of online content, as well as the distractedness and technoference of technology. And by the way, this is not only what we find within the parent population in terms of their concerns when it comes to kids. In the third episode, when I talked about children and technology, what we could see again from the common sense research is that children also find these to be concerns in terms of their own tech use, the distractedness and technoference component in particular. Sexting is something that over a quarter of high school teachers are reporting. I just wanted to pull out this other statistic, and if you are a kindergarten or elementary school teacher, I would really love it if you just sent me an email and let me know if you're finding this an issue in your own classroom. But the research found that about 9% of kindergarten to elementary school teachers also found sexting to be an issue, which is an incredibly worrying statistic. If you're a parent, by the way, who has had issues with this, I would also really appreciate it if you got in touch. What teachers report they use and what they actually find effective when it comes to technology in the classroom are two separate categories or two separate things, as I said before. I think this is probably one of the most concerning findings here. Less than 50% of teachers find that the professional development that they receive around tech use, digital citizenship is very effective. So there's still a huge way to go there in terms of really equipping teachers in the best way possible, really helping them, really educating them about these forms of technology and how to use them in the best ways possible. Um, and then a kind of a big financial concern, or something that should be a big financial concern for a lot of schools, is the fact that a lot of the technology that they're provided, that is purchased by schools, goes unused. Now, as we consider some of the improvements that we can make and how to make them in classrooms, I wanted to just kind of briefly give you a few facts about how children learn and how technology might impact that. Because the one thing that we don't know for sure, based on the research that's been done so far is whether technology in schools actually leads to significant improvement in performance, in productivity, in grades. In lower income areas, in impoverished areas, we do know that it can literally make a world of difference, and that makes perfect sense. But in other settings, we're not quite so sure. And often what we find, and I think this goes into the final piece of data that I shared with you in the previous slide, is that what we find is kind of these amazing perks and resources that are offered by big tech and big ed tech companies. We find these on the one hand. On the other hand, we find very well-meaning, very stressed out school admins who of course want to bring innovation, want to bring improvements into their classrooms. And oftentimes what that leads to is some of the stats that I showed you on the previous few slides. So a couple of things in terms of the research that I wanted to highlight to you. One is a study that is being conducted, that is just starting now in April, and it's going to go on for 2 years at the Seattle Children's Research Institute, where they're basically looking at very, very young children, looking at how they play with what we would call regular toys, such as stuffed toys, puzzles, and so on, and how responsive they are to their caregivers who are in the same room with them as they're doing that, and then how responsive they are when they're holding a tablet or a smartphone, so some kind of screen-based device. And what the researchers so far have found in their preliminary work is that children are just not very responsive to their caregivers when they're present with them and on some kind of a screen-based device. They're highly responsive when they're just playing with what we would call a regular toy. And what the researchers have kind of commented on this is that really what we're seeing with these kids is that they're overriding what is a very, very strong instinct to look. We have a hugely powerful instinct to look at the adults in our life, especially our caregivers, when they call our name or when they make a noise or when they make a movement. So what the researchers are saying is that this is basically a sign that what they're doing now, so on that tablet or on that smartphone, whatever the screen-based device is much stronger than their natural instinct. So it's almost overriding that instinct. And I think that is one very important piece of research. Again, this is going to be a 2-year study. It will be fascinating to see what we find. But it's incredibly important to be aware of that as we're transferring so much of education onto screen-based devices. We need to be aware of how they affect our brain, how they affect our most basic instincts, because they seem as though they do. When it comes to language acquisition, this is a really important area that the American Pediatric Association has really focused on and done a lot of studies themselves into how many words can children absorb when they're interacting with their caregivers directly, being read to, being spoken to, being sung to, whatever the case may be, as opposed to when they're trying to learn how to read, how to speak, and so on from a screen-based device. So this is a study that was done at the University of Washington, again, looking at very, very, very young children. So we're talking about babies here, less than a year old. And they were showing, incredibly high levels and more than satisfactory levels of learning, of phonetic learning, so learning language from live, but not pre-recorded exposure to a foreign language. So suggesting that this process of learning how to speak, of language acquisition, is greatly enhanced by social interaction. In fact, we need that live social interaction in order to be able to learn a new language. And so some of these studies have shown that children will, in fact, not absorb any new words or any new phonetics whatsoever when those are delivered through some kind of a screen-based device. Now, certain little, let's call them hacks, have been shown to make an improvement here. So in this particular study where children were being taught to learn some components of Mandarin through a screen-based device, what they found was that if you put 2 babies together instead of just one, they would learn a lot better. So again, it shows just how important that interactive component is, and having another person there, just how significant that really is. So there are certain ways in which we can tweak these screen-based learning programs, making them more interactive, allowing the children to impact and change what is going on the screen a lot more. But again, at the very kind of baseline, what we're seeing is that we need social interaction, live one-on-one direct connection, in order to be able to learn kind of at the very, very top of our game. And I think that's very important to remember as we're kind of thinking, especially past this kind of home learning, quarantined learning phase, what education is going to look like after that. Some of the best practices that I really encourage, that a lot of people, not just in my field, but especially teachers, people who specialize in early learning, early development, who are the people who I think we need to listen to the most. These are some of the best practices that they encourage. So, creative use of technology. One of the other very, very big discrepancies with the teachers who were interviewed for this common sense survey that I shared with you earlier is that there's a difference between the forms of tech that teachers are using and the forms of tech that they say that they would love to use more of, or that they feel would be best for their students. So a lot of video streaming is being used by teachers, but when you ask them if that is the form of tech they think is the most effective, that's not the one. It's mostly things to do with creating presentations, with presenting to other students, and using creative tech. But we don't actually see a huge amount of usage of those forms of tech. So those are the ones we really want to try and bring right up to the surface. We want to encourage kids to engage in really skilled research and information gathering, not just simply asking Google, or Siri or Alexa or Cortana, um, or any of the other virtual female helpers, to just simply answer our questions, but really skilled research and information gathering, to really try and encourage sustained and focused use of technology that supports longer attention spans. By that, I'm not saying that we should just kind of indiscriminately encourage kids to stay online for very, very long periods of time. But what we do, of course, find is that children's attention spans have been affected by the type of technology that we use and how we use it. So they find it very difficult, and we do as well as adults, to stay online for longer periods of time in kind of constructive, productive ways. So that's another area that we really need to tackle. Encourage kids to really gain expansive knowledge that leads to things like social awareness and developing empathy, the ability to share, helping strategies through diversity of thinking. I think that's one of the most valuable things that the internet, that the World Wide Web can provide our children with. Encouraging technology use that links a lot of disparate fields. So on the one hand, using technology to link up aspects of geology, say with marine life, with climate, with international politics, for example, and looking at what are the different forms of technology that can really give children this kind of three-dimensional view of our planet. And there's so many different ways of doing that, and that's where technology is absolutely wonderful. I think balancing technology then to prevent an over-reliance on it as well is very, very important. It really all is a balancing act, as well as technoference, because we know that this is something that we're all very, very worried about, to really encourage any kind of direct human-to-human interaction. So balancing debating with conversation, with co-use and collaboration, so that you don't have isolated children spending hours on their tech unsupervised, doing whatever it is that they're doing, but to really try and link them up and put them into communities as much as possible. And one definite thing I would say is to reduce smartphone-based technology use when it comes to education. The simple reason being is that everything is housed on those smartphones, and this is why, as adults, we also have these issues, is because all of the entertainment-based, the social-based, the work-based, the planning and organization-based, the navigation-based, all the different types of technologies are housed within that one very, very small, teeny tiny device. And so doing as many things as you can, say on your laptop, which is also a recommendation for work-based technology use, is really one of the best practices, and try to kind of stay away from smartphone use. So that's when it comes to the classrooms. One of the kind of final resources that I really want to share with you, whether you're an educator or a parent, comes from an organization called the Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood. I'm actually co-chair of the parenting professionals working group within this organization. One of our other groups, the Screens in Schools group, has just completed putting together this incredibly extensive, very detailed Screens in Schools action kit, which which if you go to the website, to the section of the website, you'll be able to download the full action kit free of charge. And you can see that it has these four basic components. So, kind of what the outline of the problem is, tools for parents, tools for educators, and then some further reading resources. So I would really encourage you to head over there and to download this action kit and to share it with your children's schools, with other parents. It's really a wonderful tool that has a very kind of 360-degree view of this issue of screen-based devices in schools. We'll now move into the workplace. We'll turn to the office and to the New Yorker again. Again, looking at a few different illustrations that I think kind of summarize what I want to talk about in the next kind of 10 minutes or so really, really well. We see there with the first illustration, it beautifully illustrates this kind of inherent sort of snoopiness and curiosity and distractedness of human beings that you, I think, especially see when you shove us into very small working spaces and kind of, make us spend a lot of time with each other. So I love that. On the bottom left there, you can see a kind of a very drastic preventative method. The line reads, "It keeps me from looking at my phone every 2 seconds." Again, we know that technoference is a huge issue with people who try to create any kind of productive time during their kind of office hours, during their workday. We also see then on the next one, which is very small writing, and I'll have to lean in to see it too. The internet wants to destroy your productivity, and then the little button says always allow. So that's a really great one when it comes to technoference. And then finally, the line reads, "I can't remember, do I work at home or do I live at work?" And this is a really, I think, kind of fascinating idea, especially given what we're going through right now. And there was, I believe, a New York Times article relatively recently that I would really recommend you read, which talks about the ways in which Silicon Valley kind of disrupted, which is the most appropriate word, that work-life balance by really blurring this line. And so I think when we're talking about technology use in the office, that exactly is the problem, that anywhere can become the office, including this beautiful beach, which is an absolute crime if you ask me. And I have to be honest and say that I have been guilty of committing it myself. But I think that the blurring of that line or the disrupting of that line is really what has caused a lot of the difficulties that we're seeing right now. And so I wanted to share some of the staggering stats that we're seeing here. And as I read them, I really encourage you to think about your own habits around technology use during your own workday and see where you might be aligned with some of these findings. For the most part, I got this research from rescuetime.com. I really encourage you to check them out. They are a company that is focused on helping you manage your time better. So I definitely recommend you go in and take a look at them. One of the most staggering stats is, and this is from last year, is that 188 million emails are sent every minute. This was in 2019. It'd be very interesting to see how that has changed just within these first kind of 3 or 4 months of this year, given what we're going through now. But some of the other ones are that a staggering 84% of users keep their inbox open in the background all of the time, and that about 70%, so a huge majority of emails, are opened within 6 seconds of them being received. Now, when an email involves doing something outside of your outbox, which oftentimes it does, it can take over 9 minutes to then return to whatever your original task was. The average worker checks in with their communication tools about every 6 minutes. The average worker only has about 1 hour and 12 minutes of productive time a day without being interrupted by email and instant messaging, right? So again, communication tools of some kind. Rather than streamlining this communication time, what we're finding with Slack users is that on average, they only spend about 5 minutes in between checking of their communication tools. Whereas what we find with non-Slack users is they're able to go a little bit longer, not a huge amount longer, but about 8 minutes between checking their various communication tools, whatever it is that they're using. About 40% of workers report that they never get 30 minutes straight, a kind of a block of 30 minutes of focused time in a workday. which again is staggering. Again, I keep using the word technoference, but that is really what all these stats are illustrating. And then finally, one of the maybe most worrying stats is that once we are interrupted, and this is some of the research that has indicated this, it can take us an average of about 23 minutes, a little over 23 minutes and 15 seconds before we can go back to our original task. And again, you're seeing that with email as well. When it leads us outside of our inbox, it can take us about 9 minutes to return back to our original task. So it seems that a lot of our productive time, or what is supposed to be our productive time, is actually trying to get back to what we were originally trying to do, and constantly being pulled away and being distracted, and then trying to keep kind of reversing back and coming back to that original spot. Of course, it's not technology itself that is doing this in an autonomous way. It is other humans who are doing this. But it's important to kind of keep in mind what are the tools that are being used in order to do that, and what are the behaviors around it that are a little bit problematic that we really need to do something about. So on the one hand, what we have is this kind of abundance of interruption, technoference, distraction, multitasking, overstimulation, and you know, in some extreme cases, this state of alarm and stress that we're constantly in. And what we want to try and move to a little bit, and I thought using the example of a classical musician, maybe a little bit extreme, but I think it's a very interesting example, because what we want to move into is a greater state of focus, of attention, of productivity, of creativity, of cooperation, of innovation, and of flow. And the reason why I think a classical musician, or a musician in general, really, especially concert musicians, are a very interesting kind of mark or benchmark to try to work towards, is that they can't afford to receive a Slack message in the middle of their performance. They can't afford to receive an email in the middle of them playing their instrument, and then stop and then check it and then come back to what they're doing. So they get these solid blocks of time, sometimes hours even, during which they're really able to engage in this kind of flow state, which I encourage you to read up a little bit more about. There's a very well-known book that came out about that years ago at this point, but the research in that field is very interesting. And again, like I said, it may be too much of us to expect those, you know, very extensive, you know, hour-long or 2 or 3 hour-long solid blocks of time during which we won't experience any of this interruption, technoference, and so on. But I think it's just a very interesting kind of mental exercise to try and aim towards that, you know, as much as we possibly can. When it comes to the best practices, there are a few ideas here, and we could talk about each and every single one. I think for at least an hour or two. Maybe that's an idea for kind of for some future episodes. But the first one is to really try and create technology-free spaces, times, and events that really try to inspire joy and innovation. There's a wonderful TED Talk on this a couple of years ago that I encourage you to have a look at, that really looks at how we create the spaces we work in, and how they don't actually encourage a whole lot of joy and a whole lot of innovation. And I think technology is one of the culprits there. So really trying to designate those spaces and times and interactions between employees where technology doesn't really have to play any role there at all. Encouraging employees to create notification checking schedules, so switching off all automatic notifications, and really encouraging people to set up their own times when they're going to be doing this, so that they control the tech doesn't control them. Adopting the use of maybe only one or two communication tools, and not just that, but really clarifying the rules around how these communication tools are going to be used. What are the acceptable ways of using them, and what are the unacceptable ways of using them as well? I think that's hugely important and can go a really long way into really drastically reducing those levels of technoference. Really recommending that employees set aside personal devices, at least during certain blocks of time. If it's not possible for them to do it throughout the day, doing it for maybe 15 minutes or half an hour for 2 or 3 hours, even if possible, to help them shift all their activities as much as they can to one device. So like I was saying earlier, when it comes to education and to learning in the classroom, to try and keep the number of devices around to a minimum, try to kind of sort of mainstream everything into the desktop, into either the laptop or the desktop. to really try and balance very meaningful in-person communication with tech-based communication. The reason why I say meaningful is anytime we talk about in-person communication, people often think about meetings. When people think about meetings, they often think about, please let me do anything other than have to sit through another meeting. And so meaningful, I think, is a very important word here. So even if it is a meeting, how can we make it more meaningful? How can we make it more productive and more creative? And how can we make people feel differently about going into a meeting so that it's not something that they dread, even more than, say, the 1 hour commute home that day. So really infusing meaning into it. Incentivizing employees to set start and finish times for their working day, for people who work from home, for freelancers, for people who do a couple of different freelancing jobs. It can be a very, very difficult thing to do. So really try to incentivize and help people as much as possible, not just as a kind of a more senior manager, but really even as a colleague, to get people to really set those times for themselves so that you have a very clear beginning and end of your workday. To set a good example if you are part of more senior management, and to try and kind of follow these practices as much as possible. If there are spaces within your company that are supposed to be designated, meditation rooms or relaxation rooms or socializing rooms, whatever they are, to make sure that you as a part of senior management actually use them. I've been into a number of companies that have absolutely beautifully designed interiors and beautifully designed spaces meant for exactly those things. And you may not be surprised to know that they don't get used at all, right? And I think part of the problem is that people who have more senior roles don't actually lead with that trend. So that's really important. Overall, what we want to try and increase really is a scarcity of tech, in the sense that you want to reduce the types of tech and the behaviors around tech that cause also all those issues that I presented in the previous slide. When the tech is there, we want it to really be helpful, and we want it to make us more productive and more creative and more innovative and better at communicating with each other. We want to increase the friction as well. It's a very well-known term, and oftentimes people who design technology try to reduce the friction. The word seamless often comes up. I think that in order to be digitally well, we need to up the friction. We need to make it harder to access technology, but the technology that we absolutely need, again, to make us the most productive, the most communicative, that's the one that we want to increase. We want to make it easily available. We also need to make sure that it's very easy for us to tap back out of it, and to make it at that point as scarce as possible. We want to increase control, and we want to increase balance as well. And so as we kind of wrap up with this, I'll have a couple of slides left. In terms of a more kind of future-oriented best practice, just one kind of small thing that I wanted to bring up that, again, I think is very relevant to the current situation, is safety and monitoring of employees. What we're seeing now, because so many people are working from home, is this huge surge in essentially tracking software. So a lot of senior managers are using these different types of software in order to track their employees to make sure they know what they're doing at all times. We're hearing some reports of people being asked to stay on Zoom calls for 3 hours and 4 hours and 6 hours and 8 hours all day long, so that their colleagues or their bosses can kind of check in and out with them throughout the day. So I think these are some of the practices that we really need to keep in mind when it comes to digital wellness inside the office, wherever that office may be. I think one thing we definitely don't want to see becoming kind of normal practice once this whole physical distancing and quarantine period is over, is that we have more people continuing to work remotely, but that their digital wellness becomes seriously damaged because they're going to be so heavily monitored, and because these expectations are going to be there, that they're going to stay connected to their devices constantly. As we kind of slowly wrap up this whole series, right? It's a 5-part series. This is episode 5. We're going to be finishing up with this topic for now. I just wanted to kind of remind you again of what digital wellness actually is. Like I said at the beginning, it's still a relatively new concept. It is highly relevant to all of us as individuals, but we need to get clear on what that actually means. And so being digitally well means using technology mindfully, intentionally, and humanely, in such a way that it doesn't tarnish your psychological or emotional well-being, or the psychological and emotional well-being of other people. So that's a more kind of general definition that I like to put forward. When applied to the workplace, it should be all of those things, but it should also really lead to an elevated kind of learning, creativity, and productivity, the same really as what we saw in the original wall painting that I shared with you in the School of Athens. So I'm going to slowly wrap up over there. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. Again, if you'd like any more information, either about myself or Made of Millions, you can find it out through these different social media platforms. You can also send me an email if you like. Like I said, we're wrapping up our digital wellness series with episode 5 on technology in the classroom and the workplace. This is definitely not the end. And so I do have another live series that will be coming up very, very soon. So if you're interested in that, be sure to stay in touch with me. Be sure to come back to the YouTube channel of Made of Millions. And I'll just give you 2 words as a kind of hint as to what the topic is going to be for our next series, and that's positive psychology. So thank you once again so much for spending these past 40 minutes together with me. I hope you learned some interesting things about digital wellness in the office and the workplace. And again, I hope you take care of yourself. I hope you stay safe and healthy. Thank you.